All right, we're now live for the March 2023. I'm still getting in the habit of saying 2023 AMA. Got some questions lined up already that will take me a couple minutes, and you can write your other questions. Those of you who are already participating, I see there's 12 people already lined up. So the first one is about Kant from lapse nine continuum. Why was contradiction or lack thereof so important to morality as Kant understood it? It seems the element of contradiction is what makes the categorical imperative so powerful and binding. What does the incoherence of ideas have to do with wrongness? So we start with something pretty substantive there. First of all, I'll say that lack of contradiction or contradiction being a sign that something is wrong is definitely not unique to Kantian ethics. Um, you see it in Epictetus with Stoic ethics, right? He talks about mache or contradiction, and that's kind of an important matter. You want to try to like avoid those. You could think about Thomas Hobbes and his discussions of the absurdity of people acting contrary to the laws of nature. There's discussions running throughout, right? So contradiction is definitely not unique to Kant or to the categorical imperative. And I think it's important to remember too that the categorical imperative has three formulations. Contradiction or lack thereof is important to the first formulation. It's not important in any explicit way, as far as I can tell, to the second, which is act always so as to treat humanity in your own person and that of others, always as an end, never as a mere means. And then the third formulation about the kingdom of ends. I don't think it's actually quite as central in there. But so let's talk about the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Why would contradiction, in the maxim that you're proposing, that as a universal law, why would contradiction be important? Well, because it shows you that some things are going to be incoherent. And if they're incoherent, then it's not what a rational being ought to be doing or justifying or claiming for itself. And I think it's that straightforward. I don't think there's any great mystery here. It's not just looking for contradiction that's the issue. You also have to formulate your maxim and then universalize it, sort of imagine what the world would be like, what the entailments of it would be. So contradiction is one of several different moving parts that are involved in the first formulation of the categorical imperative. All right, so let's move on to Jupes. This one's easy to answer. Have you ever had an interest in the philosophy of science? Not much. If so, what works in that area did you read and what did you think was the most valuable? I mean, I've read philosophy of science insofar as I've had to. We had preliminary examinations that had reading lists for epistemology and philosophy of science as one of the four prelims. And, so I read the standard fare stuff, Kuhn, the structure of scientific evolutions, and, other various things along the way, some, Lakatos and some Popper and people like that. Um, and so, that's basically been it. I'm not competent listed as an area of my competency because I don't read that stuff very much. And I kind of think that you can pick at most like five or six areas that you're going to work in productively and competently, and going beyond that is kind of tough. All right. Quintessential, you're not late. We were just getting started here. Eamon, would you compare, contrast Sartre's nausea, Nietzsche, great pity and great nausea, and Hume's pity as a form of hate? Obviously, very different. Um, yeah, I mean, I'd have to go back to Hume treatise book 2 to see. Pity as a kind of hate doesn't sound right to me. Um, but I'd have to take a look at it because usually pity is construed classically as being a form of feeling bad that other people are feeling bad or doing bad. But Sartre's nausea, um, is not the same thing as Nietzsche's discuss or mentions of nausea here and there. Sartre is more like a reaction to the whole world. I mean, the first place that Nietzsche references nausea, by the way, is Birth of Tragedy. I want to say in part three of it, but it's been a while since I've been in there, and I remember being struck by that back when a decade ago when I was like reprising these works and being like, "Holy crap, maybe that's where that came from." But I don't think there's a huge connection between those. Hey, Mark, good to see you there. So you said speaking of Kant, just wrapping up the third critique. Your thoughts on the text, specifically his idea that human teleology is to be found in our culture. Not sure what the German term is. Yeah, I think that. So this is going to be a little bit of a rant. A lot of times people will be like, especially when they're like looking at my top 10 books in philosophy books I bring to a desert island sort of thing. They're like, why not Kant's first critique? And I'm like, because I wouldn't bring Kant's first critique. If I was going to bring any Kant, one single book, it would either be the second critique or the third critique, or it would be the full metaphysics of morals, which includes the metaphysical elements of virtue and the metaphysical elements of justice, because that stuff's way more interesting. I don't find the first critique, to be, I've talked about this in the Texts with Aura thing. People take it as, oh, such an important work of philosophy. And it's important, but it's not like earth shattering. I think there's a lot of people sort of buying the self-serving propaganda about the Copernican turn. I mean, it's interesting. It's important, but it's not that important. The third critique, I think, is where a lot of cool stuff happens. And as a whole, I don't think the book has the same sort of, let's call it, everything hanging together and you can see exactly how you're getting from one place to another as the first two critiques go. But there's a lot of really, really cool stuff in there, right? Discussion of what do we consider to be beautiful and why do we disagree about matters of art and beauty. The discussion of the sublime is really cool. All this teleological stuff is really, really cool as well. So I'm kind of a fan of the third critique. I think you can tell I'm like warming up, right? Um, Red Stoica asks the question that somebody asks every single time, and I always give the same answer. Can you do episodes on Eastern philosophies? First of all, there's no such thing as Eastern philosophy. That itself is the wrong way to look at it. There's Chinese philosophy and the entire Chinese cultural sphere, which extends into Japan and Korea and stuff like that. But each of them brings their own thing to it, and that's very different than the Indian subcontinent and its philosophies and stuff like that. And we've got all the stuff that's happening along the Silk Road with very interesting interactions. We've got Islamic philosophy. So let's avoid that term Eastern philosophy because that's already kind of Orientalism. And why don't I do stuff on that? Because I don't read the source texts in the original languages. If I want to read Cicero, I can read Latin. If I want to read stuff in Chinese or Japanese or Indian philosophy, I don't read Japanese or classical Chinese or for that matter, my Mandarin never got better than reading 250 characters. I don't read Sanskrit. I don't read Pali. So I'm leery of wandering in and doing stuff on stuff that I can't like go back to the source text. And I'm not a specialist in any of those. I've taught that stuff, but that doesn't mean that I'm the person to be doing videos on it. And the third thing is we have a division of labor in the philosophical world. Not everybody has to do everything. There's plenty of great people out there doing work on, stuff from the Indian or Chinese cultural sphere. And so you should go to them and look at their stuff rather than asking somebody who doesn't do that kind of stuff to shift their emphasis and focus on that. I don't even get to most of the authors that I would like to cover in European philosophy, or classical American philosophy, let alone these other things that other people are much better at doing. Oh, Bruno, nice to see you here. Thanks for another of those self-directed studies videos. Those are really cool. Yeah, I think they serve a kind of purpose. I mean, it would be cool if other people were making them as well, so we could get some different takes on some of these figures. Maybe there's things I'm leaving out. I will be doing one later this month with a video premiere on Hegel, and then we're probably going to go back. It looks like people were more interested in Augustine, and then Hume, and then we'll do Hobbes, and then we'll see where we go from there. And there's plenty of other people that we'll do down the line. If I crank them out one a month, then we can actually get quite a bit done. All right, let's see. It just skipped a little bit. Jacob Murphy, much in the market for complete works of Plato. Which do you recommend? Looking at Jowett's 1937 Random House or the edited by John Cooper. Whatever one you want to do is fine. I mean, I don't care which one you read. You know, they're both fine. Cooper is a more recent translation. There's Jowett didn't translate all the stuff himself, right? So I think it's useful sometimes to look at multiple translations if you can't go back to the original. So I don't endorse one over the other or anything like that. On Milahan Philosopher's Corner, do you have a favorite Game of Thrones character? Now that is a good one. I certainly have some favorites. Obviously Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister and Arya, right? And in the books at least, Daenerys. I don't think she was done particularly well in the Game of Thrones series. We're talking about the Song of Ice and Fire. Who else? I mean, you feel kind of something for Samuel Tarly. Brienne, of course. And I do like the Hound, even though he's kind of a bastard. You can definitely feel some empathy for him. Now, if I had to pick my favorite one, also in the books, Jaime Lannister is not quite the bastard and sister screwer that he is in the show, right? And he does have kind of like a redemption arc. I probably would pick Tyrion, but it's kind of tough. There's some really well developed characters in that whole mix. So, all right, Leslie, married gay Catholic priest and Blondell scholar John McNeill used Blondell's work to advocate for acceptance of queer sexualities in the church. What are your thoughts on his work? Do you believe same-sex unions are based on disordered affection that cannot endure? Blah blah blah. So I actually corresponded with ONeill at several points back in the day when I was still in graduate school and early on, and he tried to sort of enlist me in some public campaign that he was attempting to do at one point that fizzled out. And so I think that ONeill was an activist who had definitely been kicked around a lot by the church of his time, silenced for a while, treated pretty poorly. I don't think as a Blondell scholar that he was particularly great. And so there's that side. And then there's the, sort of like constantly pushing the envelope on sexuality. I've thought about this a lot over my time, and I think that it's not something intrinsically disordered, or if it is, then we ought to look at it as intrinsically disordered as everything that heterosexuals are engaging in themselves. You look at the divorce rates and the constant screwing around and obsession with everybody else's sexuality and the proliferation of pornography and abusive relationships. And I don't think that gay relationships are any more subject to that than heterosexual relationships. And that's my view on it. So, I think what we're going to see is a reevaluation of this sort of stuff going on. And I think there's grounds for it already. That said, I didn't find ONeill, who, I mean, or McNeil, who's like brought him up right recently. He's been gone for quite a while. I didn't find his stuff all that compelling. So, all right, Mistful, what do you think about Slavoj Žižek? I think there's interesting stuff there. You got to wade through a lot of crap to get to the interesting stuff, and that he, like many continental people, is much more prone to like throwing out a whole bunch of stuff in front of you without enough careful drawing the lines between things. So I think Zizek's early work is rigorous and good. I think that much like Derrida, as time went on and he became a star, I think the quality of it declined considerably. So, all right, Felix, may you give me your 2 cents on ethnocentrism or Kim Clare's book about the Black Korean conflict? I haven't read it, so I don't even know who Kim Clare is. Ethnocentrism, very common, leads us into all sorts of stupid things, all sorts of problems. So, but it is a kind of common cultural tendency, one that we're going to probably have to learn to overcome if we want to ever have our act together as a whole species, you know. Javier says, why do you think so many psychologists in the US so quickly dismiss psychoanalysis and the whole field of psychoanalysis? Well, that's an interesting question, and it has to do with a lot of back history. For a long time, psychoanalysts basically ran the show, and like a lot of people who were in power, many of them were dismissive of other approaches, even those brought forward by other psychoanalysts. So you could think about Albert Ellis and rational emotive behavior therapy. Ellis was originally a psychoanalyst, and he brought forward this new approach, and they excoriated him for it. You could think about, Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, right? You could think about all sorts of other things that the psychoanalytic establishment was constantly pushing down and repressing and saying that doesn't fit into these theories, right? Even certain psychoanalysts who were admittedly kind of off the beaten path, like Reich, weren't looked at very well by other psychoanalysts, and that the psychoanalysts dominated the scene for a long time, and then there was this backlash against that, and now what we see is psychoanalysis a lot of times just kind of dismissed unfairly because depth therapy or depth psychology and the therapies associated with it, they're useful tools. So I think that's explains the US thing. As a side note, when you read Lacan, it's very important to keep in mind that he was rebelling against the psychoanalytic establishment in favor of a return to Freud, who he thought that they had essentially abandoned. Andaliva, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on Axel Honneth? I don't have any thoughts on Axel Honneth. I've never read Honneth's work. I know of Honneth as like part of the kind of penumbra of critical theory, but it's been quite a while since I was, doing Frankfurt School related stuff. So I never got into Honneth. Milahan Philosopher's Corner, an Orthodox Christian theologian who isn't a heretical woke person is who you should ask advice from concerning marriage in Christianity. Anytime I see the word woke used in that way, I think that the person who's using it is either a grifter or ideologically bound in with their binders or not very bright. So I would avoid trying to talk about, woke stuff, at least here, because you're making yourself look foolish to the person you're addressing. Made of Clay, any good movies or shows you've seen lately, Dr. Sadler? Yeah, I've been, my wife and I have been watching our way through the second season of Hope Street, which is a BBC Northern Ireland production. We've been enjoying that. We just watched the last episode yesterday. We also watched our way through the new season of Vera, which is about these are both cop shows. Vera is about a Northumberland. She's not a chief. She's I'm forgetting her rank. She runs the show for a police homicide group. I've been watching The Mighty Boosh, which is one of my, people talked about comfort shows a while back in there. What are your comfort shows? What are the shows that you'll watch again, even though you've seen them because you just enjoy watching them? And for me, The Mighty Boosh, Red Dwarf, which I watched my way through recently, Venture Brothers, those are all shows like that for me that I'll, even though I've seen them multiple times, I'll go back and watch them. Haven't seen any movies lately. And that's partly a function of like being kind of too busy to take an hour and a half or 2 hours and just sit there and watch a movie. So, all right, Luca's got a great question here. How does one avoid becoming a pessimist with regard to the state of philosophy? I know that the end of philosophy has been announced for a long time, but I still find hard. I find it hard to rid myself of this. So let's. There's two different important questions there. Let's take the easier one first. So the end of philosophy. People who talk about that are just full of bullshit because if you're a historian of ideas, you know that this like the end of this has been announced so many times. The end of metaphysics, the end of philosophy. Wittgenstein let the fly out of the fly bottle. Jean-Luc Marion actually has an article, and this is from like 20, 30 years ago, called the end of philosophy, or the end of metaphysics, right? So people have been talking about this sort of stuff and essentially talking out of their ass or doing so in self-serving projects, because with the end of philosophy, we're supposed to like pay attention to their philosophy. People have been doing this now like the entire 20th century. So don't worry about that sort of stuff. That's just people, being people, and that provides us with a good leading thread into the other thing. How do you avoid becoming a pessimist with regard to the state of philosophy? Again, some historical perspective is very useful. You see that, you know, great philosophers often get passed over for good stuff or not read in their own time, and or their reputation is ruined. Think about Mary Wollstonecraft and the vindication of the rights of women because her stupid husband, after she dies quite young, writes this tell-all biography. That sort of stuff happens all the time. There's no direct correlation between merit or quality and being paid attention to at any given point of history. And you see all these non-entities kind of rising because of their contacts, or they happen to be trendy. That's been going on for centuries, so that's not that big of a deal. It doesn't have to make you feel bad or bring you down. And you think about how wonderful it is that we live in a time where we have access to just so much cool stuff. I mean, you could read the rest of your life and never run out of interesting new authors whose thought and works you can explore. Well, that's really awesome. And then if you want to try to adapt it to your own life or talk to other people about it, we exist in a time when that's quite possible. So I don't think that it's not as if there isn't any reason to be pessimistic, right? But being pessimist is kind of a choice among a whole bunch of different ways of interpreting the current field of philosophy. So if you find that the field as you are experiencing it is really bringing you down, maybe you want to migrate to another part of the vast domain of philosophy, and then you feel better, right? So, all right, Mila Hans, have you read and watched House of the Dragon? I don't have. I don't really have time for that sort of thing. Spin-offs. I'm not that interested in the Targaryens, quite frankly, and their backstory. And I moved on to plenty of other stuff. I got the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. So we're now like looking at this month and next month Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars series. So if George R. R. Martin doesn't want to get his act together and like finish out Song of Ice and Fire and wants to fart around with other stuff, more power to him. But I'm not going to bother with it probably. Max, what are some of your thoughts on Ralph Waldo Emerson as a philosopher? I'm doing an American philosophy course this semester, and I find some of his ideas pretty interesting. That's probably a good way to put it. Some of his ideas are interesting. I don't think he's like a first-rate philosopher, but he's an interesting guy, and he's got some stuff to put on the table to consider. He's certainly important in that, understanding that milieu of American transcendentalism, which is really cool. There's a lot more to American philosophy than just pragmatism, and that's one particularly important movement. So, you know, somebody who I've read, particularly since I went to Southern Illinois University, right, where classical American philosophy was an important part of the department. The Overgiver. Have you heard the song "Heritage" by the metal band The Kindred? Nope. If it's I listen to mostly what we call classic or traditional metal stuff, bands that started in the 70s or the 80s, and they may be continuing on into the 90s, 100, the aughts as they call them, and then the 20 teens. Like, for example, the two different bands, Tank or Judas Priest or whoever. But I'm not listening to a lot of newer stuff, so generally the response that you'll get, have you heard this band? Have you heard this band? Is going to be, nah, I haven't. I'm usually spending a lot of time with the catalogs of much older bands. And if it's got lyrics about the history of philosophy, that's great. I don't go to metal stuff particularly for lyrics about the history of philosophy. If it happens to be in there, that's nice. But as a philosopher, that's not a big draw for me. Henry Martin, you probably get this question a lot, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the decline of the humanities and universities. Seems like most I talk to say it's not really worth it anymore. Well, that's because you probably talk to people who aren't, all that bright, and are not like doing work in the actual field, or fields rather, of humanities. And what are we talking about with humanities? We got, literature, rhetoric, philosophy, religious studies, history, and a bunch of other associated fields as well. You could maybe say art history fits in there. Um, Again, sort of like with the end of philosophy, these big announcements out, the decline of the humanities. There was a recent New York Times, I think it was, article about that. These are like a little tiny, they're getting like a little snapshot of like this school over here and this school over here. They're not doing some massive survey of things. There are philosophy departments that are closing, there are philosophy departments that are changing, what that they're teaching, or they're shrinking. And then there's philosophy departments that are cranking along, doing just fine, and hiring more people. You got to look at like the whole picture. People are majoring in the humanities and going on to have, decent careers and decent lives. So I would say a lot of this decline of the humanities stuff is, very selective, looking at things. All right. I just skipped a little bit. Let me scroll back up. Mystical HD, what are your thoughts on Marx and capitalism in general? I mean, Marx exists, capitalism exists. Marx provides us with some analysis of how capitalism works. Some of it is interesting and useful. Some of it is probably, a bit too dated, because capitalism itself, as Marx recognized, changes its configuration as we go on. And he died back in the, 19th century. So that's probably enough right there, because that's, such high level stuff, I don't know what we can say about that. Tish says, "What do you think about the maxim priority should be given to worse?" Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a common thing in a lot of different ethics. I have no problem with that. Dr. Beavis, I've got no questions. Just want to give my thanks for this interesting discussion. Oh, that's very nice of you. You're welcome, and glad you're here. Max, working my way through the De Anima, I'm scratching my head, trying to figure out his interpretation of Plato's Timaeus of the soul in book one. Any things that you think I should keep in mind? Yeah, it's often helpful to keep in mind that Aristotle when he's criticizing Plato is sometimes criticizing what we've got in the actual texts, and sometimes it appears to be stuff that was like taught at Plato's Academy, and sometimes they get kind of blurred together. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind, the De Anima, as far as like a systematic text, is a hot mess. It's going all over the place, and it opens up a lot of questions that it doesn't, completely answer. Um, in a way, it's not an incomplete work, but in a way, it is. So, I would keep all of that sort of stuff in mind. Um, and you can go back to Plato's Timaeus. There's some interesting discussion about the parts of the soul. Aristotle doesn't accept Plato's tripartite soul. He's got a different way of dividing up the soul. Um, but in the Timaeus, it's actually associated with parts of the body, right? So like here's where the rational part is, here's where thumos is, and then down in our belly and genitals is where the epithumia, the appetites reside. Um, so that ties in a little bit with the mind body connection and stuff. Marco says, which philosophers would you recommend concerning the issue of dealing with guilt? Overthinking a situation from the past. The Stoics would be good for that. Seneca actually and Epictetus actually talk about people that he doesn't use, they don't use the word overthinking, but, or like thinking about things in unproductive ways, but they talk about that quite a bit in their works. I think you can see that in other virtue ethicists like Plutarch, who's a Middle Platonist. Some of Cicero's works, and then you can go on. I mean, think about Augustine and his confessions and his own self-analysis, and whether you can apply some of the lessons from that to yourself, or his discussion of the emotions in City of God. So there's quite a few ancient philosophers whose discussions of like our thought processes and how they lead to emotions might be useful for you. And then maybe some existentialist thinkers would be useful as well. Yeah. All right. And Olivia, who are your favorite critics of liberalism? I don't really have favorites of a lot of things, and critics of liberalism is not something I think about or care enough about to have favorites in. I mean, if you're talking about like people who are critical of some aspects of whatever liberalism is supposed to mean, that's by itself an equivocal term. I mean, I like Alistair McIntyre, right? I disagree with him on some things, like his read on the Stoics, or some of the medieval philosophy stuff, or whether we should vote or not. I mean, he actually wrote a piece a while back in the 2004 election, making the case that you couldn't really vote for either party. But he's a critic of liberalism, and he's somebody I like, but he's not my favorite critic of liberalism, right? Eliadic, do you believe in God? Yeah, I do. Google user, what philosophers do you kind of live by? Oh, a good question here. Sometimes you get the feeling of you being an eye which looks in all directions, but see follow none. Well, you definitely got the wrong take with that. I definitely don't look in all directions. Nobody looks in all directions. And I think, if you follow me a little bit more closely, you see me endorsing and teaching about, and oftentimes applying stuff that comes from a variety of philosophical traditions. So, in the ancient world, the Platonist, the Aristotelian, and the Stoic movements, I draw on them pretty frequently. I'm a Ciceronian eclectic, as I've talked about many times, meaning that I, like Cicero, draw upon these and try to systematize them together. There's Christian thinkers, who I engage with and like quite a bit. The person I've published the most on is actually St. Anselm of Canterbury. And I've, done quite a bit of work on early Christian thinkers um, as well, who are reacting to ancient philosophy. Existentialists are important for me, dialectical philosophers. But there's others who I like some aspects of and have written a lot about, like Rene Descartes. So, um, you know, it's better to say not that I live by them, but I live in dialogue with philosophers who I think have something to contribute to me. And to my relationships with other people. I've learned a good bit from, say, Rainer Maria Rilke or Mary Wollstonecraft about what the possibilities for genuine love and personal development in a romantic relationship could be like. So those are just a few examples. MZ, have you read the book What is the West by Philip Nemo? Nah, I haven't read that. Agan King, how realistic is it to do a bachelor's degree while working a first full-time job? Kind of depends on, the rigors of both and what your own capacities are and, what your obligations are. Do you have a family that you have to support? Do you have things that, are going to hold you back physically or mentally? How bad is your job? How good is your job? Do they offer tuition assistance or things like that? I mean, there's so many different factors. I don't know how we're going to easily give a sort of like it's exactly 65% difficult. It doesn't really work like that. Guy, what are some current discussions, problems in epistemology? I don't know. You'd want to ask somebody who works in epistemology, and that isn't me. Ken, hey Ken, good to see you here. Speaking of old bands, I'd strongly recommend the last few albums from Saxon. They're every bit as good now as they ever were. Yeah, they have been. Saxon is a band. I'll say this too, that has never disbanded. There have been two different Saxons for a while. As a matter of fact, there still are, right? There's the Oliver Dawson Saxon who tried to bogart the name, and then they got their butts handed to them in court. And then there's Saxon led by Biff Byford, which is as far as I'm concerned, the real Saxon. And yeah, they have released a lot of great albums, like well, I won't even say from Thunderbolt on, because there have been other good albums, Battering Ram, stuff like that, going all the way back through their whole catalog. But recently, yeah, they've put out some great stuff. As a matter of fact, I'm blanking on the name of their album that came out. I think it was 2011, maybe, or maybe it was last year, and it actually had a song about COVID on it, which was quite heart wrenching in a way. So yeah, Saxon, they're really good, and I've seen them twice in concert myself. I'm sure Ken has seen them. Ken is fortunate to live over there, where a lot of these bands are touring. There's so many like great new wave of British heavy metal bands that are still together and still touring, but they don't come across the Atlantic, or if they do, it's only to a few places. So, all right. Let's see here. Ashmare, do you think philosophers need to be more public facing in eras where people look more to gurus, grifters for answering the big questions? Do philosophers have a responsibility to publicly combat this? So two different questions there. Do philosophers need to be more public facing, whether it's in an era of gurus or any other era? Yeah, some philosophers need to be public facing. Not every philosopher needs to be public facing. As a matter of fact, maybe not even half. And I would say philosophers who want to be public facing or engage in public philosophy but do a crappy job screw things up for the rest of us. So we don't want just anybody doing that, right? But we do want to promote it, and we don't want to, for example, um, I know students who have come to me because I do public philosophy, and they've said, my professors are discouraging me from like having a YouTube channel or doing, outreach to the business community or stuff like that. They're saying I'm selling out. They're saying I'm wasting my talents. I should be focusing just on academic, traditional academic stuff. And I'll say, well, screw your professors. You do whatever the hell you want. It's your life, right? And it's really kind of sad that a lot of these professors, I think, out of a sense of like just not understanding or maybe envy or fear, they don't want other people doing this. And we do need people doing public philosophy. Now, is there a responsibility to go toe to toe and battle the gurus? I don't think so. I mean, I'm going to be writing a piece this month titled "Take the Training Wheels Off," which is going to be about people reading say Jordan Peterson and being like, oh, he's I can't get rid of him because he was my way into this, or reading the Daily Stoic, which sometimes quotes things that are actually mistranslations, and being like, oh, well, that's where I got my entrance into Stoicism. And my response is going to be, that's fine. You can remember them fondly, but recognize their limitations. If you're riding a bike, you don't keep the training wheels on like a little child for the whole time you're riding the bike. You use those training wheels and then get rid of them and ride your bike. Do real philosophy. Do real thinking about stuff. Don't keep yourself held down by these guru types. A guy has a big question here. What do you think drives creatives to make art? I mean, it's all sorts of things. And I'm kind of lucky. I'm working in a place with lots of creatives, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I'm the only philosopher there. And I teach classes like ethics for artists and designers, or philosophy of human nature, or world religions, or a bunch of other stuff as well. And so I get students in my classes who are creatives. And what is it that drives them? Some of the same stuff that drives all of us: needing to make an income, needing love, relationship, support from other people. But they also want to, they engage the world, they engage their media, they get into these grooves where they're working, and they want to express or tie into something that is valuable, that is greater than themselves. So I think that's part of it. um Vegan sports bar. In Schopenhauer's essays, he advises one conceal their talents and intellect to avoid the envy of idiots, but what one must express themselves, and why consider others to such a degree he didn't seem to. um, you know, he could be saying, this is what I've learned from experience. Yeah, he was very in your face about his talents, and people thought he was a prick as a result. And part of it was the way in which he did it. Even his own mom, you've probably seen that letter where his mom was like, you're a smart guy, but you really piss people off. Why don't you learn and become a person who could actually get along with other people? Schopenhauer also, and this is something I've been meaning to do a writing about for a while. Schopenhauer also thinks that you have a not only moral permission, but perhaps even duty to protect yourself from other people who don't have a right to the information about you that they're asking for. So that it's not only okay to lie to some people, but it's the right thing to do. So yeah. All right. T.S. Apostolos enjoyed your Tolkien on fairy stories. Yeah, it's a great essay, right? There's a lot of cool stuff in there. I'd read it before, but sometimes you don't see everything that you need to until you have to teach about it, which is what I do in the videos. We'll be coming back to some other Tolkien stuff down the line, I think. Um, uh, Tugin Kakir. What do you think about the Frankfurt School? They're interesting. I read them quite a lot in graduate school. Tried to do some writing, and I did publish one piece very early on in my career about Adorno, largely drawn from negative dialectics, a piece that's actually been like put into anthologies and stuff like that. Um, I've never been able to effectively write on Adorno after that because his thought is just like all over the map. I enjoy reading him, but it's difficult, right? And then, I mean, who else in the Frankfurt School? I've read Eric Fromm, I've read Marcuse, I've read um, Horkheimer, and I do like the Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's a much more readable work because Horkheimer brings to the conversation kind of a focus that Adorno maybe doesn't have. And then there's Habermas. I've actually taught Habermas in the past, and I do like some of his stuff. So I think the Frankfurt School they can be interesting. Soli 2222. Have you read into any traditional Islamic theology, particularly ones with scholastic traditions such as the Asharis? Yeah, I've read some stuff. Like I said earlier, in answer to a question about Eastern philosophy, I'm not a specialist, right? I don't read Arabic, so that's kind of a handicap. And we only get so many hours in the day. I spend mine mostly reading European philosophers, not reading too many other people, unless I have some reason to. Hunzia Newman, I'm researching the question, is the mind a tabula rasa? I'd like to know your opinion on it. Give me a suggestion for books, academic articles on this topic, either against it or for it. Well, I can't do the second because I don't read in this area. I've never really taken the tabula rasa idea seriously because it seems like a flawed metaphor to me. It's clear that people want to attribute to Aristotle, but that Aristotle doesn't think anything remotely of the kind when you actually like look at his works. We have some capacities, some structures kind of in place, and I think it's one of those things where the way the problem is set up is kind of screwy, right? Either it's like there's nothing in the mind and everything comes in from the outside, and then maybe some reflection gets turned on it as well, because even the empiricists like Locke and Hume talk about that. Or like there's some structures already there in the storehouse of the mind, a la Descartes. The old empiricism versus rationalism, thumbnail sketch kind of stuff. It doesn't seem like either of those are adequate to me. Um, I think it's more interesting to look at how our ideas work together with what the phenomenologists call intersubjectivity, which is largely structured by language and culture and stuff like that. So I don't think there is any tabula rasa that you can actually point to. All right. Lamp says, I'm inspired by the practical achievements of science and the logical clarity of mathematics. What would you say is the measure of truth in philosophical texts? Can we spell out the criteria? Nope, we can't, because nobody's going to agree on it anyway. People have been trying to do that for hundreds and hundreds of years. Look back on the old attempts at that before suggesting new attempts, I would say. And I don't think that there is a single like mode of truth. I think that we have a number of different ways of thinking about truth, and they don't all neatly map onto each other. And they sure as hell are not encompassed by just the correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, deflationist, whatever else we're going to add. There's all sorts of other important discussions of truth that often get overlooked by the people who are bringing these things up. So I don't. That's kind of a non-starter for me, I would say. Oh yeah, so Ken brings up the Saxon thing that I was talking about. That "Remember the Fallen," the song about COVID from the album Carpe Diem. Really good album. Yeah, yeah. And when Scott and I begin doing classic metal class again, we have the intention of doing album reviews of recent albums by new wave of British heavy metal bands that are still churning out really great stuff. Like Girl School has a recent album. Raven, of course, is constantly working on new stuff. There's Tigers of Pantang have been putting out new stuff over the last couple of years. That's really quite good as well. So there's going to be some of that. Rush Paul, your recent Descartes videos have been great. Thanks for them. Any plans for more? You even have fans all the way over here in Taiwan. I don't think I've done any recent Descartes videos other than the self-directed study video, right? So I did videos a while back on Descartes' the discourse on metaphysics, discourse on method, and the meditations on first philosophy or meditations metaphysique. Um, so you might be thinking of those. I'm glad they've been helpful for you. I will be doing more stuff on Descartes down the line. I think that if I was going to do another text, probably the passions of the soul. Um, and I'm going to be offering a class on Descartes starting in May, going through the meditations, over Zoom. So yeah, Michael says I'm becoming a physician, but don't find the work much more appealing than most other career paths. I'm choosing it since docs have a good salary, hours serving other, but not because I love it. Is there any hope I can somehow make this career something I love after all? How does one make a good career from something they don't love? So that's a really great question. And I think that's quite thoughtful. And I'm glad to hear that you are pursuing the path, even though it's not something at this time that you really love, because um, you know, there are good points to it. And the most important part of this is the idea of serving others in a very determinate way. There are goals to medicine that should never be lost. Curing disease, alleviating pain, helping people as they approach death. These are very, very important matters, and the medical profession is part of that. And I think that there's probably this is can be generalized to many careers. It doesn't have to be rewarding for you in the ways that you're looking for right off the bat. Sometimes you have to do something for a while, and then you can see what you didn't see before. um, Sometimes it's experience, sometimes it's dialogue with other people, sometimes it's seeing other physicians cases and them burning out and being like, oh, what happened there? Let me try to avoid that sort of thing. So I think the best thing that you can do for yourself right now is to take the pressure off of yourself, to find it intrinsically appealing, and say, I'm just going to kind of go with this. And I mean, like, if you go to med school, and you're doing your residency, maybe you're doing your residency right now because you say, I'm becoming a physician. um, and you give it 5 years after that and it doesn't really work for you, well, you can do other stuff. There's nothing that says you have to be locked into that career path forever, right? um, but sometimes you do have to, like, give it a while to see what comes to mind. So that is a great question. um, all right, Mark Heffling. Today's media environment overloads us with quick takes of lengthy text that I fear leads to many people that presume they're educated but in reality aren't. Yeah, sure, that's true. Little quotes. I mean, that's always been a problem. A lot of these quotes that turn out to be um, wrong quotes, like the ones that I bring up in my videos on Aristotle and Plato and Marcus Aurelius, the fake quotes, they often come from books that were published around the turn of the century, kind of self-helpy almanacs that would have all these little quotes in them, right? And sometimes they would be attributed to that person in there, and these were fake quotes, right? And sometimes it would just be that person saying it, and then somehow it got attributed to Plato or Epictetus or pick whoever else, right? So this sort of complaint, we could make this of many other earlier generations. All right. Andrew, is a selfless good deed possible? Not only possible, happens all the time. Itamar Drori, do you think there's a fundamental difference between the two concepts? What two concepts? I'm not sure what the context there is. Google user, your thoughts on David Graeber. I'd have to look up who that is. The name seems a bit familiar. American anthropologist and anarchist activist. Yeah. He's the guy who wrote Bullshit Jobs. I've read that. Actually, I'm going to be doing a review of it. I think that's a great book. I've not read anything else that the guy has written, but Bullshit Jobs is actually quite good philosophical analysis of a very important concept. So, yeah. All right, Yeshu, seeking some suggestions for my dissertation. I want to work on or investigate the supposed relationship between technology, desire, and violence, not exactly surveillance state. Well, then, uh, my suggestion, dating apps. Lots of information out there about ethical quandaries that involve the technology, that involve desire, certainly sexual desire, but also other desires like desire to be entertained, the desire to like have dominance over other people, and then all sorts of cases of violence that have occurred. Um, that might be a very concrete thing to research and examine. Reb, is there a connection between Schopenhauer and Camus? Did Schopenhauer influence Camus directly? I mean, Camus read him, right? But Camus read a lot of people, and Camus is actually much more optimistic about this world that we live in than Schopenhauer ever was. I will say this though. This is going to be a little bit of a digression. We often frame Schopenhauer as if he's this very pessimistic guy, right? And a great Schopenhauer scholar who I was fortunate enough to get to study with, Wolfgang Schumacher, at the European Graduate School, the year that I was a visiting scholar there, and my wife was finishing up her PhD coursework there. So I was in Schumacher's Schopenhauer class, and he proposed in distinction to the gray Schopenhauer that everybody says, oh, it's so pessimistic. He called it the white Schopenhauer. And I think he was modeling this off of Marion's distinction between I think it's gray ontology and white theology, théologie blanche of Rene Descartes in his books. And Schumacher was saying, here's what I've, sort of figured out in my decades of studying and thinking about and applying Schopenhauer. He's not as pessimistic as we think. The world is messed up, really, really messed up. Human beings are really, really messed up. So we have to figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to make it through this world. We don't need any like big picture meaning or stuff like that to try to do it, things that we want everybody else to believe in, but we can figure out what actually will make us. And he even used the word happy there, um, and I think there's like a similarity there to how Camus treats dealing with this absurdity between us and the world as well. So, all right, Rexel Queesbag, how does one marry Thomistic metaphysics with Husserl's phenomenology? I mean, why in the hell would you want to do that? But if you did want to do that, I mean, maybe you could read Edith Stein, who kind of did that, right? She actually, by the way, was the honored guest at the very first day of the Société Thomiste Day of Studies. She was the person who was presenting there, um, and it was 1932, I want to say. So maybe look at that, or I mean, why Husserlian phenomenology? Why not cooler stuff like Schalerian phenomenology, like the Lublin School did, or Heideggerian, or pick whoever else you want. um, So yeah, Rhea, hard to keep doing something for a long time if you don't like it, but this person may end up liking it. Very good point. Yeah. Although people do things that they don't like for years and years and years. My uncle Hubert, who you may have seen my video talking about him, massive influence, not just on my life, but my whole family's life. Um, he, he had a grocery store for quite a while, and it went bust because, you know, he extended credit to people who he knew couldn't pay just so that he could keep the food economy going in his part of Chicago. And then he had to go to work as a welder, which he was very good at, incredibly talented. I mean, there were a lot of things that Uncle Hubert was very, very good at. But he hated it. He was not into it at all. And he worked that job for 30 years before he could retire from it and then leave it behind altogether. Um, People do that. I've known plenty of people who work jobs that they're not into because it puts food on the table. And there's nothing wrong with that, I think, you know. Tobias Solberg, how much of early Heidegger do you need to read and understand in order to get the late Heidegger? Exactly 150 pages, and they have to be exactly the right pages. I mean, there aren't any real answers to these sorts of questions. You can jump into the late Heidegger without having read the early Heidegger, and you're not going to understand everything that you're reading anyway. So um, especially the first time that you're reading it, you're going to have to keep going back over it and go back and forth and stuff like that. I mean, it depends too. Which early Heidegger should you read? Some of the early essays, like What is Metaphysics, or The Whole of Being and Time, or maybe certain lectures on things. It kind of depends on what work you're going to. And you got to realize too that Heidegger thought these things through and changed his mind about stuff down the line, as well. Ooh, what philosopher is best in times like today, in your opinion? There is no best. Um, if I thought there was a best, you would see me working just on that philosopher, I suppose, right? That would be the practically prudent thing to do. But I don't think that there is a best. I think that we think about the situations that we're in, and then we look for the resources that might help us. And it's a constantly cobbled together process that we have to revise at different points. So there isn't a good answer to that one. Layap says Luca's earlier question got me thinking about periods in my life when my confidence in philosophy waned. Other times, certain works strike me as profoundly true. I just have a hard time saying why. I think that's a common experience. Yeah. Um, there's a lot of people have like the idea that like philosophers, they live this completely rational life and they understand what they're doing all the time. And when they decide to read this person, they have great reasons. They've ruled out all these others, and it just doesn't work that way at all. So much of what we do is a matter of contingency and what the ancients called fortune, or chance. And we get things that we're into for a while, and then we're not so interested in them. I mean, I went through a whole bunch of phases. You can see videos about those things, and I threw myself into them when I wasn't partying and having relationships and stuff like that, or worrying about mundane matters or working out, or things like that. But that's a good point there. You're not going to be like, as we say, firing on all cylinders all of the time. There might be periods of a year where you're just not that enthused about stuff, and life will sometimes beat you down that way too. If you're going through grief due to somebody dying, or the loss of a job or a relationship, um, having to attend to the needs of others, like a child or a parent, or a friend. Those things can sap your energy. Physical ailments, getting older sometimes, having injuries, getting COVID, those sort of things can take away as well. All right. Leo says, are there any sci-fi series you think are underrated? Well, that's an interesting question. You know, we watched our way through this American version of a British show called Utopia, and it was really getting good, and then it got canceled. And the reason it got canceled was that there's the laundry. Um, I think it came out. Did it come out in 2020 or 2021? It came out during COVID, and the idea of there being a 2020 is the year. Um, so there's like, here I'm going to read the thing. A group of young adults who meet online get a hold of a cult underground graphic novel, which not only pins them as a target of a shadowy deep state, uh, but also burdens them of the dangerous task of saving the world. Right, and it's very bloody, and there's a lot of things going on in it. Um, and it was really quite good. It was surprising, and it just, you know it was the wrong time, wrong place. Bringing something out about a disease being spread like that during COVID, not a great idea. But how could you have planned that, right? Other underrated series. I mean, I'm a huge, huge fan of Blake's Seven. I watched it when I had COVID. I watched my way through the entire 4 series of it, and holy shit, is it good. And they had zero money to do it with, so it's solely a credit to good writing and good acting, because the special effects are terrible, the scenes are terrible. The BBC basically tried to strangle the show, um, and they didn't know that they were getting a fourth season either. So that's another good sci-fi show. um yeah, what others? I don't know. I'd have to think about that more. Um, Hunzia says, "Have you read the God series by Mike Hockney?" No, I haven't read it. I've never even heard of it. Is it like a speculative fiction thing, maybe, or I don't know. Um, Arcturus is Heidegger's Intro to Metaphysics a good place to start with him? How does it relate to his other work? I actually start people with a different thing. Um, what is metaphysics? And I choose that one, which I've put videos out on, as my introduction to Heidegger for people, because Heidegger is taking a lot of the big themes of his work, um, like the history of metaphysics and anxiety and the nothing and all these things, and he's bringing them together in a way that connects them up. And it's challenging, but it's not too challenging. And as he points out at the very beginning, every metaphysical problem is connected with other ones, which I think is a great thing for students to learn, because they often want to split things into, well, this is this, and this is this, and this is this, right? And there's no connections between these. And Heidegger's saying, no, no, it's all connected up, not in simple ways, but so that's what I start them off on. On to Olivia, what are your thoughts on Rorty? If you're talking about Amelie Rorty, I think her work is awesome. She's made massive contributions to the history of philosophy. I have a lot of her edited volumes, like, essays on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and essays on Aristotle's rhetoric, and essays on Descartes' meditations. She's awesome. If you're talking about Richard Rorty, he's okay. I think he was one of those people who was a big deal for a while, and nobody will be talking about him 100 years from now. I've always found his takes on things rather superficial, and he's pretty dismissive of a lot of um, traditions of philosophy that I think are important. I think in part because he hasn't spent the time to really adequately read them. Occasionally makes interesting contributions, but you gotta work to find them, I would say. Lord Tennyson's pipe, is Plato's Greek considered good or beautiful writing? Definitely, yeah. Is that ironic considering his critique of poetry and speeches in some of his dialogues? Ironic in the contemporary sense, where you say, yeah, there's a dissonance here. Sure, you know, we know that Plato was himself a poet, right? And then he leaves that behind. But like Nietzsche said, he produced a new genre of literature himself, right? Nietzsche has a pessimistic or pejorative view on this. It's taking the planks of the shipwreck of all the previous forms and cobbling them together. But some people consider the Symposium to be one of the finest works of Western literature. So that's pretty high praise, right? So is there? I think it's better to say there's a tension between his condemnation of the poets and of poetry and of rhetoric, and the incredible skill that he himself shows with both of those, including mimesis of poets and rhetors in his dialogues, not least in the Symposium, right? Where he imitates the comedic poet Aristophanes, who's a character in it, and he imitates Gorgias's rhetoric, putting that into the mouth of Agathon. So, yeah. All right. Google user, have you seen HBO Succession? Only when my wife is watching it, and I find it totally uninteresting myself. I'm not usually into shows like that, contemporary business people and their family dynamics. I just there's other stuff I'd rather watch. Mark, if we conceive of a child not only as a biological status, but a familial role, what are some characteristics you would define a good child, notably in adulthood, and conversely a bad child? Oh, that's a great question. So, if we think about role ethics, which you see, like, for example, very heavily in Epictetus, right, or in Cicero, but also I would say to some degree in Aristotle and Plato and their traditions as well, and then later on carrying forward into early Christian thought and medieval Christian thought. Um, Very often, the ancients and medievals thought of, like, the relation between child and parent as not like other relationships. It's quasi divine, right? Because they are the not creators, but the generators of your being, and so you owe something to them, right? Um, Now, what would that comprise? It's interesting if we think about this. So it's going to change as time goes on, right? So early on, you should, try to learn from your parents and work within the household, cooperate, do your part. Whatever resources they're giving you, try to use those prudently. Will we do that? Of course not. We'll kind of, screw up because we're kids. And actually, the parents are usually screwing up half the time too. Um, when you become a parent, you realize how hard it is to be a good parent. So there's that going on, right? And then, as our parents age, particularly in a time when the aged are becoming very, very vulnerable to exploitation by others within, late capitalism, where protections are taken away from them in order to enrich other people. We have to be like advocates and defenders of our parents, even if they're hard to get along with. um and be prudent in that, not like always. It's not an excuse to, like, oh, you were controlling with me, so I'm going to be controlling with you. It's more about, like, helping to reason with them, and make it to the point too where, like, if they start suffering dementia, we have to start making decisions for them, and they don't like that. Usually they're usually kind of upset by that, right? So I would say that's part of it. And then, another aspect that's very important, um, figuring out how to get through all the crap that we went through together and imposed upon each other. You know, Um, so we those of us who had parents for a long time, um, our parents weren't perfect and they screwed some things up, and learning how to, whether we want to forgive or not forgive, what we're going to hold them accountable for, and what they're going to hold us accountable for. We have to work our way through that, you know, if we want to have a strong relationship with them. So I think that's important too. Idamar says, "Has my question about Freud and Nietzsche been sent?" I haven't seen anything. Um, you know, maybe if your question isn't showing up, maybe you put some words in there that are like uh, getting flagged or something. Vegan sports bar. Do you think it's possible to change habits after 30? Not only is it possible, I see it all the time. And I've done it myself. So, yeah, of course. 30 isn't a magical number. And you can even not only learn habits, you can all or change habits. You can like learn languages or, you know, learn mathematics, all the things that people are like, oh, no, 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 you can't do that unless you're young. They're full of crap. It's a little bit more difficult to learn languages, but you can do it. People do it all the time. Um, Risert, I want to really get into Kierkegaard. Are there any must read academic pieces on him? I mean, nothing comes to mind for me, but I don't spend much time reading academic pieces on thinkers. I spend time reading the thinkers. So I don't know. Sure, there's probably some great ones out there, but I don't read a lot of secondary lit on Heidegger. Kantbot, any tips on reading philosophy? Got a whole video out on that. I find it extremely hard to read. Well, keep at it, and the more that you do it, the less extremely hard it's going to be. I mean, if you're finding it extremely hard right now, that's either a sign that you're approaching it in ways that are counterproductive, which you might want to take a look at. You might want to watch that video again, or any of the other many things out there on how to read philosophy, or you're exaggerating and you want to drop any sort of exaggeration and be very honest with yourself. If something is difficult, that doesn't mean that it's extremely difficult. I have students that I've had students for more than 20 years now, many of whom don't think of themselves as particularly smart, but they're able to work their way through Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and all sorts of thinkers in my classes. So, I think most people can do a decent job reading philosophy. All right, Mark, I feel Plato's skill for satire in his dialogues is often underrated. His humor can often be quite sophisticated. Yeah, that's very true. And this is why rereading is very important, right? Sometimes you're not going to catch everything the first time through, or the second time, or the 10th time. Plato is a complicated thinker. This is where actually reading secondary lit might get in your way. If you read somebody and they're like, here's the hermeneutic to understanding everything in Plato, in these 5 easy steps, don't buy into that stuff because it's not that simple. Um, all right. Nolan, what is a good thing to say to people who dismiss things for their evil creators, like people who say we shouldn't read Nazi philosophers or really listen to really evil music? I mean, why are you wanting to spend your time reading Nazi philosophers and listening to really evil music? You might want to give that a think a bit. And the need to like, ask a question about that is itself a little bit interesting. What do you need? What's a good thing to say to people who dismiss things through their evil creators? You could say, well, like a million other people have said, the originator of an idea or the originator of an artwork is not the same thing as the idea or the artwork itself. Um, I mean, if you're interested in doing historical research and understanding why the Nazis were doing what they're doing, that's a reason to read Mein Kampf. When you do read Mein Kampf, you'll be like, "Holy shit, was a lot of this stuff deranged?" It's hard to believe that people actually took this shit seriously, but they did. But then look at all the other crap that was being published at that time, and look at the nonsense, crazy shit that people who are super into racism publish today as well. Um, So I think it's probably enough on that. Um, Lord Tennyson's Pipe. I recommend Mary Renault's The Charioteer. It's about two former soldiers in 1940s England who try to form a relationship according to the ideas of Plato's Phaedrus. That sounds like an interesting idea. There was also a short story out there, and I don't remember who it was by, but it was like a sci-fi thing in the future, and they were also drawing on the symposium. Um, um, and they were talking about Phaedrus's speech about the army of lovers, which is based on the uh, Theban unit, right? And the idea was that they would produce something like this. It was some sci-fi author, and they explicitly referenced the symposium. Phaedo's speech, right? I think, yeah. Um, all right, Hansla, the God series is 32 books about the Pythagorean Illuminati Society and their school of thought. Well, you lost me at 32 books. I got so much stuff to read. I do not think I'm going to invest myself in somebody else's series that I haven't already committed to that has 32 books. So, uh, people who enjoy that, they can go on with that. Black Prairie. What is the song you use for the intros in your Spotify episodes? Well, I don't have Spotify episodes. You mean my SoundCloud Sadler's Lectures podcast episode, which you're probably listening to on Spotify, which is, by the way, not the place you want to get it, because Spotify, Apple Music, they only they only give you the last 500 episodes. So there's actually like over 800 episodes out at this point in time. I don't know offhand. I'd have to go and like look it up. Somebody asked me about that recently, and then they said that they use Shazam to figure it out. I would do that. Um, it's from Moose Open, where I get all of my classical music, but I don't remember. I mean, I started the podcast back in 2017, I think, and it's just a sound file now. So, all right. Alareza, what characteristics in humanity and human beings will still be exquisite, resembling a touch of magic, when through science we can figure out causes and reasons of everything related to us? Well, that's a big when, isn't it? That should be an if right off the bat. And that one requires some thinking about. Will we ever figure out the causes and reasons of everything related to us? Prospects are not good for that. um, not now, not in the distant future. That is a very interesting, like, science fiction or speculative fiction idea, and I would actually look at works in which that has been addressed, like Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos, where the AIs are figuring everything out to like a 99.9% probability, or Ian Banks' Culture series, or any of these things where you've got something kind of like a utopia along those lines, to see what they have to say. That might be helpful for you. Vegan sports bar. If, according to Hegel, evil is the pernicious and subjective eye of the beholder, what, according to Hegel, is an ethical action? I mean, it's not quite so simple as that, right? So your if is already, if sometimes, according to Hegel, at some places in his works, because Hegel talks about evil and good and ethics all over the place. I mean, think about the analysis of ethical action in the spirit section of the phenomenology, which goes on for paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. I mean, here's what you can say. Um, Good action is going to be in some way like thoughtful. It's going to be connected to the totality that you're within. It's not just going to be you standing apart from it, selfishly pursuing your own ends, but sometimes there's some evil that gets smuggled in there. That's why you want to look at that dialectic in the spirit section, particularly in the morality section, where there's some really interesting stuff going on there, I would say. All right. Just skipped a little bit. Um, do, do, do. So Stradarian. Got another engagement. I enjoyed the session. Yeah, good. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Um, and Black Prairie, Nolan Cross has a answer for you right there. Um, Vegan Sports Bar clarifies that they're talking about evil music like the Glee soundtrack. I wouldn't know. I don't watch Glee or listen to Glee. All right. So I don't know what's going on with Itamar's posts, but there's a reference here to the parallel between the bad conscience and Freud's superego. Do you think there's a fundamental difference between the two concepts? Yeah, they're not the same concept. Bad conscience is within you, and it's complicated, develops over time, right? In the genealogy, it's not the same for everybody. The um, super ego is part of an economy within the psychological personality, as Freud sets it out, right? So there's some overlap, but they're not exactly the same concept, right? And most of the time that you do comparisons, it's not exactly the same concept between two people. Showstopper, what's the most depressing nihilistic philosophy book I can get my hands on? I don't know. I mean, I'm not reading things to be depressed or, you know, just because they're nihilistic. And that's probably going to be very much a subjective matter, differing from person to person to person, so I don't know. Um, Kantbot, is it true that in the two stages of consciousness, consciousness doesn't realize the object is its object and the object is more external to the consciousness, but through experience, which is the negative moment of reason when it does that, the self sublates from sense certainty, which is corresponding to the logic stage of reality? I don't know. I mean, to me, that's like at the risk of becoming word salad there. I mean, are you talking about in Hegel's phenomenology? Because you didn't even like reference who we're talking about here. I'm assuming it's Hegel, and that by the first two stages of consciousness, you mean sense certainty, which goes on for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and there's stages in it, and then perception or the thing and its properties. Before we get to the um, um, force and the understanding section. Um, but I'm not sure why you're talking about it being the negative moment of reason, a later section, um, that itself sublates from sense certainty. It overcomes itself rather corresponding to I don't know what the hell the logic stage of reality is supposed to mean, what sort of shorthand that is. So I can't really answer that question. And I'm somebody who reads Hegel a lot, so that might be a sign of something going off. Leo says Asimov spoke about the importance of science fiction and exploring the cultural imagination. Do you think any science fiction might have prepared the public for space flight or other breakthroughs? I mean, sure. Um, I mean, space flight. What do you mean by preparing the public? Like that space flight could happen or exist? I guess that, science fiction and science fantasy had been doing that for a very long time before we actually had space flight. And, we're sort of like thinking out like, so talking about the Kim Stanley Robinson stuff about colonization of Mars. I like those books because they're like posing some of the real problems that we're likely to face, which are not just technological problems, but cultural problems. If we ever do make it to Mars and start, transforming it into a place where human beings could live. So sure, yeah, I mean, science fiction does that, but speculative fiction has been around for a very long time. In the sense of like opening up possibilities for us human beings. Think about Thomas More's Utopia or Marge Cavendish's The Blazing World, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I actually have right here because I'm teaching these days in my Intro to Humanities class. And then further and further stuff, but they don't always do it in exactly the same way, you could say. And some science fiction authors are more imaginative and some are perhaps less. So, all right. Lapse for continuum, reflecting on the way I and others have asked questions that are impossible to answer adequately and the time constraints. Modern philosophy often comes in shorter packets. Thoughts on why? I don't know that modern philosophy comes in shorter packets. I mean, when you say modern philosophy, do you mean like 20th century onward? Because we usually count modern philosophy as beginning, in the 1600s, and people are still writing big old books, um, all the way up to the present. People haven't stopped doing philosophy in big old books, so I don't know what this shorter packets means or refers to. Google user, I recently saw your video on your Nietzschean phase. How did it change your thoughts on Stoicism, Plato, and Aristotle? Didn't, because I got into Nietzsche before I got into these others. So, you know, uh, I started getting into Nietzsche um, when I was, in my teens, and then continued on. So it didn't. I never really bought like Nietzsche's criticism of Plato anyway, or the Stoics. I knew he was kind of posturing and full of crap sometimes with that stuff. I was more into the other things that I found useful in Nietzsche. Henry Martin, priest or maiden? Dio, actually. If I had to pick, like, people are, who's your favorite band? And I've thought about that for a long time. If you asked me when I was in my teens and 20s, it would have been Iron Maiden. And then it changed. I got into other music, and for a while, it probably would be New Model Army. Um, and then eventually I got back into metal. And if you were asking me, like, well, who are your favorite bands? Who are the ones that you listen to the most? I don't have a favorite as such. Um, but I recognize the greatness, and my going back to over and over again a number of them. And it shouldn't be surprising to anybody who knows classic metal. Some of them: Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, massively important. Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, you know, love them both as well. Um, and then we've got Rainbow, and just the first three albums, actually, the Dio era, and then Motorhead and Tank, Raven, Girl School, fit in there. I really like Rat, really like Wasp. I do like Kiss, the hottest band in the world. But Ronnie James Dio is really an extraordinary person. Um, I've talked with people who actually worked with him. He could play all the instruments. You know, he knew exactly what he wanted. He's one of the most intelligent people in the field of heavy metal, and that's putting him up against people like Steve Harris of Iron Maiden, who's also brilliant band leader, arranger, bassist, all this sort of stuff. So there's like a very rich, complex ecosystem. It's interesting because Iron Maiden and Judas Priest actually did tour together once early on, back when Paul Di'Anno was in the band, and I guess he was a real prick to them. Nobody could really stand his BS. And it was often framed like that in like Hit Parader and Circus, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, which is the best, because they were viewed as like being at the top of the continuum. But you could say, well, wait a second, what about Motorhead? What about these newer thrash bands like Metallica and Megadeth? Where do they fit in? And of course, we've got the Scorpions and Accept, and Girl School, and a few other bands as well to talk about. All right. Oh, thanks. The Fantasy Network says you rock. Now, speaking of Dio, that of course is "We Rock," one of the first songs on one of the first albums. If you haven't heard it, you should definitely listen to it. Tobias, which group of followers is the most annoying? Hegelians, Platonists, Marxists? I mean, Platonists aren't usually that annoying. Um, that's a good question. Okay, so Marxists and Hegelians very often include people who have read glosses more than actual texts, and they've got like a shtick, right? And they tend to be very team oriented. You know, I'm on Team Hegel, Team Marx, and I would say that you know, it's not Platonists. It's more like people who describe themselves as Aristotelians or Thomists who haven't actually read enough Aristotle or Thomas, or who are certainly like not, you know, getting the spirit of their dialectical approaches to things. They can be incredibly annoying, you know, and you tend to find, it used to be that you'd only find them in Catholic circles, and now you find them in a lot of Protestant circles as well. And they'll tell you, you know, what exactly Aristotle's doctrine is and what he means by this and that, why it's so superior to modern stuff. And you'll be like, man, you're full of shit. That's not what Aristotle said at all. Here's the text. Here's what he's actually saying. I think a lot of people who bill themselves as Stoics today, especially if they don't read the Stoic texts or they read them very selectively, basically to try to do self-help stuff or to try to do a grift, they're pretty annoying. Nick Land's followers used to be, or you know, fanboys really more than anything, used to be pretty annoying. But I think that a lot of them have since, you know, left the building and abandoned him for other stuff as he took a hard right turn. Um, People who want to talk about Zizek constantly are kind of annoying. Um, but you know, I don't spend a lot of time letting myself get annoyed. Frankly, I just kind of move on from them. And if somebody's kind of a jerk, I just block them, and then I don't have to see their stuff. You know. John Garrell, thoughts on the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy? It's kind of silly and parochial. I've got, you know, a talk out there that I gave years ago, invited at Virginia Commonwealth, I think it was, on the analytic continental divide, saying, you know, yeah, there is a thing called analytic philosophy. There's things called continental philosophy, and then there's philosophy as a way of life, history of philosophy, comparative philosophy, you know, traditions like Thomism that didn't go away, you know, feminist philosophy, which doesn't fit neatly into either classical American philosophy, you know, non-Western traditions in philosophy. And to think that that the world of philosophy is split into analytic and continental when there's like this entire other range around it is really quite silly. It's sort of like saying, you know, in football, yeah, there's only two teams. There's the Chicago Bears and the San Francisco 49ers, and all the rest of them are just minor league. No, there's all sorts of teams, right? And we every once in a while add a new one to the mix. So, you know, I think the analytic continental divide thing, that was kind of an old topic back when I was in grad school, and I think that, you know, it's not particularly relevant or important for philosophy now. Vegan Sports Bar, are there any works that you think translations can't really do justice? Um, I've read some of the Greeks and Germans and English and I always wonder what I'm missing out on. Well, I mean, the good news is I can't think of any text in Greek or German that can't be translated. I don't know about languages that I don't know, like classical Chinese or Arabic, what's being missed or left out. But I can say that, you know, there's you're always going to miss something, right? The question is, and so the criterion shouldn't be, is every single nuance of meaning conveyed? That's not going to be the case, you know. Um, but no, I'm pretty optimistic about translation because I'm a translator. You know, I've done a lot of that sort of work. Oh, I didn't realize how late it's getting. I am going to have to wrap this up because I have another thing to do at the top of the hour. Let's see what else I can quickly or render an answer for from people who haven't had the chance to ask anything before. Um, Pipeline 73 on the continental analytic divide. Doesn't continental philosophy generally preserve more of what Pierre Hadot and others have tried to say was the origins of philosophy, a way of life? It does not. There is plenty of continental philosophy that is just as abstract and removed from life as analytic philosophy is. We shouldn't romanticize philosophy as a way of life. And Ado is actually wrong, as many people have pointed out, in making these sweeping claims about that's what philosophy was all doing. Some of his critics have attacked him, particularly on what the pre-Socratics were doing, on what the Platonist and Aristotelian school were doing. So we want to avoid like that sort of big picture sloppy thinking about that. Gilgamesh, would you agree with Hegel that there was no history of philosophy in places like America before colonization, Africa, and even with China? He doesn't think Confucius is a philosopher. So Hegel doesn't say there was no history of philosophy. He says there is no history in Africa. Much bigger claim, right? That's in his philosophy of history. And I think Hegel's full of shit on that. I mean, it was a foolish thing to say. There was already enough information available to him to not, give in to that sort of silly racism. But he did. And so this is, a weak point in his works. Doesn't mean we have to throw him away, but he certainly should have known better. So yeah, let's see if there's any other ones. Roger says, do you know any philosopher from the 20th or 21st century that try to create a big system like Hegel? Yeah, there's plenty of them out there. I mean, we used to actually get these books by this self-published guy at philosophy departments who like worked out a whole system, and I forget his name was Paul something or other, and he'd send all these books for free. There's lots of people trying to develop systematic approaches to things. I doubt that will ever end. There's always going to be people doing that. Let's see here. Here's a good one to go out on. So from Fantasy Network, what is the most metal speculative fiction series you've read, and why is it the Second Apocalypse? So we're talking about R. Scott Bakker's 7-book at this point series. Really, really great imaginative stuff. I would say Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos arguably approach that. What are there any other ones that I've read recently that really develop the worlds and are brutal? I think we want to think of it like death metal and brutality and stuff like that. I mean, it's tough to top R. Scott Bakker in that. Um, so he might be the one. If you haven't read his stuff, you definitely want to check it out. And I've got some videos about his work as well. All right, so I gotta head out. We're actually way past the time, so it's easy to lose track of time when we're doing this sort of activity. Thanks to all of you for your questions, and we'll do this every month. We got some other good events coming up later on this month, and I will see all of you somewhere down the line, somewhere else in the ether.